Greetings, Bermuda. My name is Aaron Hill. I'm joined by my brother and good friend, Mr. Ryan Robertson, Parent Chief. Ryan, pleasure to have you back.
Likewise, my brother.
How you making out?
I can't complain. I can't complain. It's a tough situation all around, like we said. And so, of course, we like to send our condolences again, as we do at the beginning of every show, to those who have been impacted by COVID-19 at present. I believe since we last spoke, there's been one more death, and we send our condolences to those families.
Absolutely. And again, just want to extend our gratitude to the essential workers who are on the front lines, particularly the new testing lab at Southside, being led by Dr. Karika Weldon. I know yesterday at the press conference, the Premier had mentioned that there was an enormous capacity, daily capacity for testing, particularly for essential workers. So we want to thank all of our essential workers, but in particular, that testing center, as particularly we're moving to closer to the date where the shelter-in-place regulations will come to an end, at least for this interim period, while we wait to see what happens in the future. And so it's imperative that we know that the essential workers who have been on the front lines and making themselves vulnerable to this virus are protected and ensure that they're safe and well.
Although we will be coming out of the shelter in place on hopefully May 2nd, we do know that the issues stemming from this will last for a considerable amount of time. So just to reiterate for those who are just joining us, the purpose of this series, graciously hosted by Bernews, is to have some productive and critical conversations surrounding the impact and the future as it relates to COVID-19. So we'd like to thank Bernews again for hosting us, and we'd like to thank you for joining us. One thing we'd like to do at the beginning of each show going forward is sort of recap what we did on our last episode, as well as talk about some of the viewer feedback we've received. So, Aaron, if you want to give a recap of what we talked about.
Well, on our first series, on our inaugural series, we had Mr. Stratton Hatfield and Miss Sierra Burrows. Miss Sierra Burrows, a law student in the United Kingdom, and she talked about some interesting topics, particularly whether internet as a universal right, whether it be a right become a constitutional right, particularly in an age where we're depending more heavily on internet. I even look at this connection here, and I think that I've got a lower definition than you. And we saw during the last series that I had cut out during some periods. And so this is something that's very important, but even this would be useless if our viewers didn't have access to internet. And so we're starting to see Sierra highlighted the importance of internet, Stratton with respect to resilience and our coming together as a community and looking forward, particularly as our individual and collective happiness as a people as compared to a GDP index or looking at the economy. And that important, weighing that balance up. Particularly in times like this, where we're in unprecedented times, all confined to our homes. There's a balancing act, particularly on the act of the government, of you want to open up the economy and start to recover and respond to the impact, but at the same time, the health and well-being of your citizens is paramount. So they don't have an easy task, but I think Stratton highlighted the important balance that needs to be struck, at least for us as individuals.
Right, absolutely. And then you also mentioned internet. So technology seems to be another hot topic. And drawing on some of the feedback for some of our viewers, that was also briefly mentioned as well, how the internet is impacting things and how people are coping. Some of the other feedback we also got related to topics that people wanted us to talk about in the future, which I think we'll also explore. Things like mortgage and credit suspension from local banks. One question was asked of us, who should shoulder the burden? And I think that's probably something we can debate. And it's also timely, considering we've seen recent reports of people calling for pay cuts and things like that, as well as Sierra, our last guest, who talked about leading by example. Other things that we were asked to explore include the landlord and tenant relationship, insurance companies, and also education and how are our schools coping. And I think education ties in pretty well, along with internet, with our guest of today.
No, absolutely. And so that our viewers know, and he'll be coming and joining us momentarily. Our guest for today is Mr. Deon Smith. He wears many hats, so I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell us a bit about what he does. He is the owner of Smith Technologies, a small business here in Bermuda, an IT company. And so we welcome Mr. Smith. He's backstage.
Hi.
Good morning. How are you doing today?
I can't complain.
Good.
So, Mr. Smith, if you could just tell us a bit about yourself and organizations that you're involved in. I've introduced you to the viewers as the owner of Smith Technologies, a local IT company. But if you can tell us a bit more about yourself.
Well, as you've already said it, I operate and manage Smith Technologies. Previously, I owned and operated Quest Consulting Limited, which I sold in 2006. I also incorporated and started Business Continuance as well. In some of my current or present areas of work, I perform services as a regulator on the Adult Education Board. In addition to the Aaron?
We're still here.
Yeah, we got you. We
Okay,
got you.
I couldn't,
You can be-
I couldn't get a lot of feedback on my
No.
So yeah, so what I was trying to say is that I'm also a commissioner on the Regulatory Authority of Bermuda. So we perform legislation, regulatory processes for a lot of the internet service providers and also Belco. So those are some of the things that I've been doing and currently still perform.
Well,
Bermuda.
Aaron, you weren't wrong when you said he wears many hats.
No, not at all. Not at
Yeah.
all.
Well,
So
you're a
you-
great guest to have, Deon, on the show. You may have heard we've talked about a couple of topics which I think relate to you, ranging from internet to education and all sorts. So we're looking forward to sort of picking your brain and asking you some questions about the current situation. So to start, how do you feel about the current situation?
Well, with the current situation, I can definitely say that I can empathize with what's going on. The coronavirus pandemic is a worldwide phenomenon that has touched every country and every person in some way. This event we had no control over, so it's going to change and has changed the lives of everyone. So, we're talking about wearing masks, gloves, sanitizing hands more times than anything else. So it's a big change that Bermuda and the world's going to have to embrace.
So is
So
that,
how do
is
you-
that like, go ahead, Aaron.
well, I was just going to ask you, right, Mrs. Smith, do you mind if I call you Deon?
Sure, no problem.
Okay, well, Deon, if you don't mind, share with us your experience. For example, like I know I was in the pharmacy today and I had my mask on and it was just slightly, it becomes a bit uncomfortable in your ears. So I had it slightly below my nose and I was getting shouted at by two ladies and I said, put your mask over your face.
Yeah.
And so I think we're becoming more conscious of how, our interactions with people are. And that's not, that it was something that was well within their rights to do, to say, because they're protecting themselves, they're protecting everybody in the community and making sure that I'm doing my due diligence and part to not only protect myself, but others. But I did think about it and I wondered, how do we transition, let's say from today, where it's Tuesday and Saturday, they left the shelter in place. Eventually we're going to come to a period where we're no longer wearing the mask, but how do we shift from we've been in 1 month shelter in place, wearing the mask, and like, I imagine that we'll, for the foreseeable future, still be wearing the mask. And every time you enter a building, wearing the hand sanitizer. And like, how do we shift as far as human interactions, particularly shaking hands? You're a businessman, shaking hands with people, even being in the same room, because we're becoming more conscious of, I want to say that we took it for granted before how much bacteria, how much germs and things that were transferring in ordinary contact. How has that affected your daily interactions?
Well, and as you said that, I don't necessarily know if we took anything for granted as far as shaking hands and stuff. That's normal. I mean, if you look at it, human beings and our bodies are made or designed to be able to take in X amount of germs and stuff like that. I mean, sometimes, people eat from off the floor and they still live and survive. So it's just that this is a nuance, either something that's been created that has caused this problem, that is a challenge that our bodies can't get rid of at the same time. So for safety purposes, of course, we're going to have to continue to wear a mask until we can slowly get ourselves out of the weeds and stuff like that, and continue to practice this safe precautionary measures as far as wearing gloves, having the mask on. So, and I just think it's just going to be time. I mean, even for us, when using computers and stuff like that, should we be wearing gloves all the time and stuff like that? Should we be doing more remote access and online education or development with applications and how we meet. That's probably going to become more of the norm than sitting around a business table for a long period of time, because you're going to think about it that
For sure.
when we all breathe with oxygen, and being in an office room for more than 1 hour or 2 hours may not be something that we may want to do anymore.
Right.
So when you talk about normal, and you talk about the what may become our new normal, particularly, and you talk about virtual interactions like such as this,
Yeah.
in your capacity, for example, tuning in. We were talking about you personally and how it's affected you and the like, but tuning into your professional capacity as a board member at the adult education school, how do you see that institution evolving or changing to adapt to the needs of individuals within the community?
Well, I think the evolution is and just like just to be reminded that, like, this has hit us as much as everyone else as a really huge surprise and stuff like that. So a lot of businesses were unable to respond right away. As you know, the adult education school is an education facility, and we actually always go on grants or support funding. So our new future or foreseeable future is most likely going to be online learning. So I think that's something that we would have to plan out strategically for the future. But we believe that we have some good ideas that would help our community and the current demographics that are out there. Because right now, as you understand, um, everybody needs new direction, needs to be tooling up. So we have to look forward to a new Bermuda, a new future. I don't think we can afford to do things in the same capacity that we used to.
So, Mr. Smith, you spoke a little bit about, having to adapt on a personal level, right? And we as a people in business and everybody sort of has to just adapt to the changing situation, which we hope, doesn't become the new normal, but very well might be for the foreseeable future. You spoke a little bit about online learning for adult ed, but you're also sort of a technical person, right? You run Smith Technologies. Can you talk to us a little bit more about your business and how that's been impacted, and what steps you think you have to take now, sort of to adapt to this changing normal?
Well, um, as you say that, impact. I don't think we've had a major impact, and luckily, one of the things that we've been doing with a lot of our clients is remote access. So for a lot of our clients, they've already um, gone ahead and start, practicing having home users being able to access their systems remotely. So for us, it hasn't been a major loss. We've been able to still support our clients, and they've been happy with the services, knowing that they've been able to get access to all of their documents, emails, with good efficiency. So to me, it hasn't been a major, knowing that one of the good things for us is that we are actually in IT. So majority of our country, our world, requires IT assistance and needs in every way. I think the good thing for us is that we've already had a good majority of our clients set up for remote access to be able to work from home or on mobiles and stuff like that. So I think it's enabled us to be able to transition them, quite quickly, efficiently, without a lot of major problems and stuff like that. The only difficult that we foresaw was that knowing that everyone in Bermuda had to
Mhm.
have a laptop. Then so that means that people had to scary to try and get laptops and different other mechanisms that was necessary, printers, to have at home to work in the same way that they would work in the office.
So with this switch to remote working and things like that, do you think that will become a permanent thing even after sort of
I,
this situation dies down?
to some degree, I think we were, like the world will probably apply, a strategy of saying, well, you know what, we would want everyone to come and attend, the offices and come in and work as normal. However, if you know that you're sick, you have a cough or fever or whatever, um, now knowing that your remote access works just as well as being in the office, it's no excuse. You can work from home. send us a note, tell us that you're working on them, and then the expectation that you're going to do the exact same work as you do in the office from home. And I think with that, it would help lessen the ability for people to get sick and flu to go around in the office, because most of the time, and it's flu season, all it takes is one person. One person comes in, and then next thing you know, it's Lisa, it's Mike, it's Jan, and before you know it, half the office is out. When half the office get better, the other half of the office is out. So I think,
yeah. No, I was going to say, I think that's particularly interesting. Not so much on the, or not as that's not so much on the influencer side, but what I'm referring to more so on a business side. I've seen some quotes that this pandemic has forced people, particularly some businesses, to realize that some meetings could have been phone calls.
yes,
Or we can use our time more efficiently and productively. As there's the maxim in business that time is money. And so now we're seeing that, for example, travel. If you've had board meetings, we've seen, for example, and we'll have legal experts come on in a later part of the series to talk about it. But some provisions within the Companies Act require board meetings to be held in person. And there are quandaries with respect to, well, can you do that? Can you substitute that for a virtual hearing and the like? But particularly with businesses like yourself, when you're doing board meetings with your clients, particularly when it's IT work that can be done, as you say, virtually, maybe that's something that not only your business, but businesses across the globe, particularly here in Bermuda, will look at. We're saying, well, look, we can have these things. We're looking at the court system, for example. Court systems are being held now, or court hearings are being held in camera, just like this. So you've got 3 screens, one with the prosecutor, one with the defendant, and one with the prosecutor, the defendant, and the defense counsel, rather. And then you got another one for the judge. So you've got all of this technology now that we're exploring and seeing, hey, look, we actually have this capability. So it's interesting to hear it from a small business owner, how you're using it to your advantage. One thing, Mrs. Smith, I know, and we're not going to talk about it too much, but I do know, looking at your CV, you've got a plethora of things on it. I note that you're a commissioner on the regulatory authority. We hope to be able to have, before the end of this week, hopefully by Thursday, to have somebody from the regulatory authority come and speak to it, because as you will know, some of the things that are transpiring now will affect, for instance, some things that the regulatory authority is considering. For example, a Belco acquisition and the like. But we'll get the requisite representatives from the regulatory authority to speak to that. Another thing I saw in your CV is that you're an entrepreneur and you've hosted a tourism event, a sports tourism event last December. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. In December, we hosted Bermuda's first and only Caribbean Grand Prix Pro Qualifier. The Pro Qualifier is an IFBB sanctioned event, so it will be difficult for anyone to get it. We were the only ones, so that was myself, Ross Caesar. So we've been able to have this attraction, and we intend to make it an annual event here in Bermuda. We decided to have the event in January so that we don't have to impose of having the event during normal scheduled events such as cup match. We don't want to conflict with any of that. We felt it was prudent to have it in December so that we don't compete with any of our normal activities that are out there. And as you are aware, in December, there's very low usage of activities.
It's not our no.
I agree.
It's during the winter months. So you've been able to, what was the success of that event, particularly bearing in mind not our peak tourism season, is actually our down season in the winter months and the like. What success did you have? Were there guests that attended? How many guests?
Yeah, actually, it was the guests came from all over the world. That is the good thing. So we were looking at probably just about 300 persons that came in from outside Bermuda, and so we had people here from Japan, India, Trinidad, from several nationalities that were here on island to compete against Bermudians and stuff like that. One of the good things about this event is that Bermudians as well were able to compete on a global stage against other people of their peers. And they did very well. We actually had a Sue Luddymore. She won 2 pro cards. So that's incredible. So to be able to vie for a pro card, to me, that is something that gives Bermudians a lot more flexibility. As you would understand, is that this is probably the only event that allows Bermudians to participate. Now, in participation, if you look at, you don't have to have a high school degree. You just have to have knowledge of oneself to be able to define your body to whatever physical requirements for that particular part of the event or category that you are in, and you can participate. And to me, we don't have a lot of opportunities like that.
No, absolutely. So can you give us a bit more background? For instance, you mentioned 300 guests came from across the world. Where did they stay? What impact did that have for instance, our local economy?
Well, at the point of time, what we decided to do, we found that Grotto Bay Hotel was very receptive. Also, Cocoa Reef. So we used Grotto Bay as the host hotel for all of the clients. Grotto Bay and Cocoa Reef got some of the additional people that when they didn't have, when it was an overflow. And then also others stayed in Airbnbs. But Grotto Bay was our host hotel, and we found that the facilities were really good. They gave us lots of options. We loved the economics because a lot of times with people that compete, they have budgetary constraints. Most of them are probably competing maybe 6 times within a year. So if you can imagine the amount of money that they have to put into training and food resources and stuff like that, it's incredible. It's even more, how can I say, challenging for women because of their suits that they need to have on and stuff like that, which is even more costly. So we found that was having it at the Grotto Bay Hotel was very good. And we found that a lot of the smaller guest environments and stuff were able to offer attractive prices.
Right, absolutely, definitely making a contribution to the local economy. We know that you said you brought in approximately 300 people. Now, we know that the borders are closed at present, and I'm sure they'll open eventually. Do you have plans at this time to continue on with the event this year, or?
Well, we've signed up again. We've been asked to hold the event again. So we are committed, and we will be having this event again on December the 5th, 2020.
Well, it's good to hear that you continue to, as of right now, you plan to hold the event as scheduled. Do you have any thoughts on sort of tourism as a whole? Events like yours, you can have yours because it's indoors, right? Provided that the people are willing to come. You're bringing 300 people to the island, supporting the local businesses and hotels. What do you think is going to be the bigger impact for tourism, particularly considering a lot of events that we have in Bermuda are, outdoors, close contact? What are you thinking in the tourism industry?
Well, I think it is going to be impacted. Not many people are going to be traveling right away off the cuff. That's going to be a thing of confidence, securing our borders, ensuring that everyone can, especially here in Bermuda, we can get this under control and, have everybody safe first. But I believe that if we're able to do that, we can open up. And when we open up, I think, we will probably be one of the first territories to be able to have other people come into Bermuda and stuff like that. I just think that we all have to work together. I know that we're probably not going to have a lot of those events that we, are used to and stuff like that. But, it's my hopes that later on within the next 8 months that, there will be, the ability for, more people to congregate together to allow that to happen. So I'm just hoping that, we'll be able to mitigate the many risks that are out here. And I just believe that, anything is possible. And it's with great hopes that, we can have our country operating sooner than later.
And Mr. Smith, do you know whether or not other IFBB or how do you say it? Correct me if I'm saying it wrong. IFFB, if other events across the globe have been canceled, for instance, if they were held sooner. So, for instance, if we're able to open our borders before them because we're looking at, I don't know if you're St. George's or Somerset fan, but it may be just by the grace of luck that St. George's or Somerset rather keeps the cup. Many have said because we may have to cancel cup match, and that's in July, August, right? And so you look at it from that perspective and say, okay, well, take it 3 more months down the line, and you're almost in December. You're prepared, you're optimistic at this point in time that we're still going to have that event. For instance, let's assume that the events that we're normally used to, like Carnival, don't happen. The cruise ship tourism industry, we've had so many cancellations already. If we don't have them, that will be tragic for Bermudians, being we've already missed, for instance, we're canceling the Good Friday and Easter holiday. We've canceled the May 24th celebrations. If we miss cup match again, really, if we open up our borders and everything's fine per se by, let's say, the November, December mark, and you are able to have an advantage, this may be one of the only tourism that can put you on the map, can put Bermuda on the map, that, hey, our borders are open for business again?
Well, even as you, well, first of all, I believe Summit is going to retain the cup anyway. But with regards to Bermuda, I mean, as you're aware, it's not about me. It is about our country and our territory. And I think this is one of the reasons why we've tried to facilitate or have this event in December, because we know that the numbers are lower for tourism in December. So it is with great hopes that, in December, we can have the opportunity to move this to the forefront. And as you said, Aaron, I truly agree with you that many of the IFBB pro qualifiers that they have throughout the world actually have been canceled. They are not operating, and they wouldn't have them this year. So I'm thinking the same way that you were thinking, that many of the events that have been canceled, people's minds are probably more than likely going to be geared up to focus on having or coming to Bermuda for our event, since it may be one of the few IFBB pro qualifiers for this year. So that's what I'm thinking in my mind. And I am, again, have great hopes that we can actually have that, have this event, because I think it's going to be good for Bermuda.
Yeah, I mean, noting that, the current tourism, the way that things are going, a lot of events that are, with close contact or outdoors or in certain places may not go ahead. We do hope, Mr. Smith, that you are able to have your event in December. Hopefully by then, at least we will have come to at least, a sense of more stability than we have right now. I do have one more question for you. I'd like to pivot for just one moment, because I know you're a tech guy. With Smith Technologies. One of the comments from our last show, somebody was asking, what was the potential for financial technology after this pandemic? There was a talk about things like cryptocurrencies and fintech for Bermuda. I'm just curious to pick your brain for a moment. Where do you think technology is going from here?
Well, when you say technology, and it's been here. A lot of times, we get blinded, because I believe that, a lot of times, Bermudians, we are stifled through legacy legislation, different things that, companies that are kind of the end all be all, the, large companies that wouldn't allow entrepreneurs to break through. I think now is that we have to have a different mindset. We need to start thinking that, we all should be working together. We shouldn't try and pull each other back. We should be trying to allow our minds to freely move beyond borders that are not in the same way that we would have previously. We have to realize that, the persons on top can't always make that money. We have other people, entrepreneurs that are, have great ideas. And I think they deserve opportunities. We need each other. And we have to realize that, Bermuda's like a small ship just stuck in the ocean. Mm-hmm. We don't have much to offer the world. Yes, we do. We have tourism, international business. But the thing is that, can you imagine if we were all educated in such a way that, from the infancy of childhood or early education, the development of having such a powerful education that enables, I would say, most or all Bermudians at the age of 17 or 18 to have a minimum of 5 GCSEs. I think at that point, Bermudians and Bermuda will be a knowledge capital. We will be able to sell our ideas. We will be able to sell our knowledge. Just imagine if we had um, lawyers, a whole bank of lawyers, and we were able to speak multiple languages, Japanese, Spanish, and we are selling our knowledge. They need us to assist them with their corporations, with their documents. To me, these are things that we should be thinking about. To me, education is key. Education can help stamp out a lot of the issues that we currently have with people that's incarcerated, because I believe that we are not putting it at the forefront. If you educate people, when somebody is highly educated or educated, that they understand a lot more, they can get ahead, they can develop themselves. Why would somebody want to harm somebody else when you're educated? Because your mind's going to tell you, well, it's foolish. It doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't even see that as something that comes into your mind. So I think that, we have to restructure, we have to redevelop, and we have to be open with a lot of our ideas and the way that we move forward. We can no longer look at holding things back, having, these types of attitudes. It just disjoints our community.
Absolutely.
And if you look at it, it's Bermuda's a very, very small country. Even though we're big in a lot of other areas, we can look at the impact that we are now facing and the challenges. Who is going to help us? That's what I want to know.
No, absolutely.
Or do we help ourselves?
Absolutely.
Who has the ideas?
And those are the questions that we have to contemplate. There you have it, Bermuda. That's Deon Smith of Smith Technologies, commissioner at the Regulatory Authority, board member at the Adult Education, and entrepreneur. We're going to be looking forward to confirmation. We're optimistic with you. We join in your optimism that you'll be able to have your event, and hopefully that event can stamp its presence in that mark of the tourism calendar in the year, so that we can stretch what is our peak season in tourism. And this may be an opportunity for us to look at, for instance, are we able to capitalize on what was not normally our peak season during tourism in the off season? Are we able to stamp events in our schedule, in our calendar, to have yearly? For instance, if you're able to have 300 people at an inaugural event, look at the potential that you have moving forward. So we're definitely watching that space. We thank you for your contribution. We thank you for your time. We appreciate it. It's been a pleasure speaking with you this morning.
If I can just say, and I know that we didn't get to the rest, and I know that we're coming to conclusion, but one of the things I was hoping, because that we've made a lot of legislation changes and stuff like that, and some of the things, because as you understand that, tourism is a very good product and stuff like that, it's my hopes that, there is going to be some sort of legislation or a look from hotel property management of, being able to give a $99 rate, or having hotels that can actually have, a certain bank of rooms that are $99 rooms that would allow all people from different economies to be able to visit Bermuda. Because to me, that's what's going to be important. We have to see Bermuda from a numbers game. And this is one of the other things that I think we need to take advantage of. So I just wanted to thank you as well for letting me get that last point across. And I really appreciate speaking with you. And I want to thank you very much for the opportunity.
Very much. Deon Smith of Smith Technologies, thank you very much for joining us today.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
So, Deon touched on a lot there. As a man wearing many hats, everything from adult ed and how education is changing to sort of tourism and hospitality. And I think there's a lot to unpack and discuss there. But the overall and the overarching theme that I'm getting is we have to be able to adapt, and we have to think outside the box. Adult ed, that's an institution that's existed for decades, considering things like online learning. I mean, that's it's crazy when you think about it. You know, we know that technology is developing and a lot of places have been doing online learning for a while, but in Bermuda, for us to be pivoting and for those sorts of questions to be considered, a shift to online learning for the foreseeable future, you know, it raises a lot of questions about how we're adapting and how we're changing, doesn't it?
No, absolutely. I think that Mr. Smith was able to highlight some good points, particularly with many hats that he wears and how we can evolve not only as a small business, our interactions with people, again, from an education point of view, from a technology point of view. He seems to believe that the technology was always there, and now we're realizing that, hey, look, we have these resources and we can use it, and that's what's going to be important as we look to the future as to what really is our new normal. I think particularly when we talk to Sierra on the last series, a lot of the feedback that I was getting personally was, hey, look, I think that's an important question to have, because the old normal, what we call normal, wasn't actually the best thing. That's some of the feedback that I've been getting. And so how do we look to adjust? You know, how it's not just about rushing to get back to what we knew before, but rather we have an opportunity to say, how are we going to do things differently? And I think in the latter part of Mr. Smith's commentary, we need to look at legislative changes. We need to look at the way that we do things so that we can be competitive, because the whole world is going to change.
But the other thing he touched on at the end, you know, which I think you sort of alluded to when you talked about how we shouldn't be in a rush to go back to normal, was some of the things that he suggested have been suggested before. You know, there was this sense that he was referring to, sort of this sense that there's things that we know we should have done, but we just haven't done. And now we have the impetus to do it because of the current crisis. So when you even think about things like online learning or remote working, why couldn't we have done these things before? So I'm just wondering, you know, we're talking about not returning to normal, but also where does the drive and the willpower come from when we talk about things that we should have been doing this whole time, you know, that we haven't been doing up until this point?
No, absolutely. And I think that's a good transition into a recap of yesterday's press conference with the government, particularly again when we talk about new ways of doing things and how we've got to really assess what was our old normal and where do we move forward. We heard in the press conference yesterday the government, as we speak, are now in a cabinet meeting discussing our future for Saturday and deciding whether or not we're going to lift the shelter in place. It seemed, at least from the tone and tenor of those discussions, that that was something that was being optimistically considered and will likely occur with regulation. So what those regulations look like and how long those are going to be in place are going to affect, obviously, those new normal. One thing that I want to thank Bernews for is the opportunity to go there on behalf of this great news media entity and ask questions. That was my first opportunity to step into the shoes
I
of.
was just going to ask you about that. You know, so you spent last night. You went to the press conference on behalf of Bernews for the first time. What were you feeling at the time? You know, we've had for the past month and a half, we've had over a dozen press conferences. You know, government had 5 a week, and then they went to 3 a week. And you know, this week we saw you there for the first time, and you asked some pretty good questions. How are you feeling? You know, what's your thoughts on sort of how last night went?
Well, first of all, I was grateful for the invitation to attend on behalf of Bernews, and I don't take that invitation or responsibility lightly. Bernews is a reputable organization, and I had that in the back of my mind, that not only am I here to ask questions for on behalf of the people of the country or represent myself, but more so on behalf of what is arguably the best news media entity here in Bermuda. And so I thought that it was an interesting pivot, because when you look at Bernews, particularly being a fact-based, these are the facts, this is the aspect, and you look at, for instance, other news media who are more investigative and the like, I thought it was an opportunity to ask some pointed questions, because we had a discussion with respect to the level of questions that were being asked at previous press conferences and the duty, for instance, this is a nice philosophical question of what duty do the media play in this new normal of a society, particularly when you only have press conferences 3 times a week where your elected officials are giving you things. So I took that responsibility serious.
Well, I will say, you know, it was noted that you took it seriously, because I was watching the live stream, and a lot of people pointed out that the quality of the questions had improved. And, you know, a lot of people seem to be happy that some of the questions that maybe weren't being asked are now starting to be asked. But we also note some questions were asked in the past and weren't answered, and they just needed somebody else to come in and follow up on them. So, you know, it definitely shows, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at future press conferences. But you did did mention briefly, and you started to touch on it, sort of the role of media and government. Now, that ties in pretty perfectly to some of the feedback we received from our last series when we were talking about this. And that was, what is the relationship between the media and the government? And what is the responsibility and the balance to be struck between journalism and sort of deference to government in a time like this? You mentioned it briefly when you were speaking to some of the ministers last night, that you were mindful of the changing situation and things like that. But what do you think, should be the relationship between the media and government right now?
Well, I think there's a balance to be had. I think that as citizens, as we all are of Bermuda, we have to be mindful that we do need unity. There is a sense of cooperation that needs to happen between all of us. But I think that the media in particular has a heightened duty to ask questions, particularly that in the public interest. And I note that, I don't know if you saw this during the exchange, but some of the responses to the questions I asked were, well, we don't have that information, or that question was already asked, but I don't have the information. And I think, and that's why I think it's important to have this discussion, because I'm going to ask that information again at the next press conference. And I think that's the level of duty. I don't think that there is a chastising or, an overwhelming sense of criticism or hostility that has to come with it. I think that it's important that the public knows the answers to the questions that are being asked. And so I think that there has to be a sense of persistence and consistency and a level of respect between the two entities that, hey, I've got a duty to ask these questions. You have a duty, not to me, but to the public, to provide answers. And I think that when you have that mutual respect and understanding between the two, then they can coexist. I thought last evening, for all of the questions that were asked across the board, I thought that we saw a nice dialogue, particularly with the Premier, who, notwithstanding that the Minister of Health would provide an answer, would ensure that, hey, there's no doubt about the answer that we wanted. And so he would come in. I thought that was good leadership.
Yeah, it's a constant ebb and flow, isn't it? So when we talk about the media, I even noticed, prior to this, the public had been starting to get a little bit aggressive at some of the journalists, right? Because they were saying, you asked this question before, why are we still asking the same questions at the press conferences when you only have 4 or 5? And I had to raise the point that, sometimes just because a question is asked, it doesn't mean that that question has been answered. So you do have to ask the question multiple times. So it was a good thing that we were able to get an undertaking last night, for the first time, I believe, that when a minister or somebody says, I don't have the answer to that, you don't just move on and say, okay, well, next, you get a commitment or an undertaking that we will try and get those answers to you, so that in future press conferences, you don't have to ask the same questions again. And I think government, they'll appreciate that too. The saying is that high tide raises all boats, right? So when you have an effective mechanism for asking questions, it also allows government the chance to answer some questions and clarify some things, which I think the Premier said himself, I'm glad you asked that question, because that allows me to explain sort of what we were thinking here.
No, absolutely. And I think, like I said, the common understanding between the two parties, and also recognize, and I think there's a balance to be had, because yes, you do expect the answers from the ministers and the elected officials. At the same time, there is an enormous amount of pressure on each and every one of them. And I could imagine being in their shoes, sitting there and waiting for approximately 30 questions about to be fired off in rapid succession. And you've got to, well, what's the answer to that? So in some respects, you do give them a bit of leeway. You did give them a bit of leniency in that regard. But I do hope that as we move forward, the level of questions will not only improve, but also the level of responses regarding the government will improve. And it's also going to cue the public up, the listening public. For example, it's not an adversarial nature. It's not, okay, well, if you don't give me an answer that I don't like, I have to respond to your answer. Ultimately, the judges are the public. That's who the duty is owed to, the information. And so if they believe that the question was skirted, if you skirted behind the question, or you don't have the information available to you, that's ultimately something that the public at large will decide. I don't think that's a place for journalists in that respect. And that's why you saw my conduct in that regard. Ask the question, get the response, and hey, look, if you don't have it today, can you provide it at the next occasion? And I do
ultimately what you are, right, in that role as a journalist, in that sense, is a microphone for the people, so if you have people, and a lot of the questions that we asked, or that you asked last night, were guided by the public and the feedback we got from this very show. And so it's important to understand that when a journalist is in the room, they're not only asking questions for their own satisfaction, we would hope, but they're also asking questions and being a voice for those who may not be able to be in that room. So I think that's an important thing to point out. I mean, especially when you compare it to other countries, like if you've seen some of the press conferences they have in the United States, it's just completely unproductive, And so it's good to see somebody like you in the room, as well as the other journalists who were there. I believe there were some other new people in the room last night as well. And it's always good to sort of see that sort of engagement. And I think from going forward, those press conferences will be a lot more productive in getting some of the questions and answers, exchanged that maybe some people felt weren't being asked.
No, absolutely. And I would just say to the listening public, watch that space. I don't know, for example, if they lift the regulations on Saturday, what effect that has for the normal regime of press conference. Maybe we're a little too late for this new regime of action and questions. I don't know. We'll come to see. We remain hopeful also that the government are listening in and provide. And what I'm hoping to see is that some of the questions, for example, I had other questions that before I could ask them, the Minister, for example, of Health and the Premier had mentioned it in their brief. Mm-hmm. And so that, albeit it's the evolution there, because you're really there not just to ask questions for the sake of asking questions, but to get the information. So if the government can get ahead of the box, so to speak, and sit there and say, well, here's what we've got to say, provide the information, then there may be situations where you only ask two, for instance, because they provided the information. And that will be the ideal scenario. You don't just ask questions for the sake of asking them because you're there to ask questions. You're really there to get the information. And the government recognize, hey, look, I don't want to be asked that question tonight. So let me include that in there.
I mean, it shows that you're in touch with the people as well, right? Because if you have an understanding of the types of things the community are worried about. So, for example, I know that in the initial stages, people were concerned about what the testing process was and what exactly was this virus? What was it like? And so government committed to working with DCI to produce different infographics and charts to get the information out there. So when the government is in advance aware of what types of questions might be asked and they voluntarily release that information, it just works better for everybody, and it reduces sort of the pressure and the anxiety surrounding the entire situation.
Sure. And I think now's probably an appropriate time to talk about some of the feedback that we got from our last series and highlight or at least get some discussion going on that feedback, particularly as you mentioned at the outset, the landlord and tenant relationship, the mortgage deferrals from the bank and who should shoulder the burden. And even more personal and particular feedback, like we're in suits today, Ryan. Some people were a bit, why are you guys in suits? And I know for me personally, it's an opportunity to dress up. I don't remember the last time that we've been able to go out and interact. And also the level of discussion that you have. There's also a psychology aspect to it. Particularly, I know when studying, for instance, and sometimes going to school, for when you're doing mooting, for example, in law school, you go there. You're not going there, for instance, on a daily basis. You may be wearing a tracksuit to school because that's your everyday attire. Mm-hmm. But when you go into moot, there's a certain level of seriousness that you hope to. So there's a two-found.
Yeah, the psychological aspect, But also, I was just tired of wearing sweatpants all around the house, I don't want to be like that,
No, exactly. But channeling that in now to some of the feedback that we got when we talk about landlord and tenant. I know during the next couple of series, we're going to have some legal experts to come and talk about the actual legal implications of deferring tenancy or being able to enforce it, particularly in circumstances where the courts are not readily available at present. But what do you believe is addressing this collective identity that Stratton and Sierra talked about on our first conference? Where do you believe the balance is to be struck there? If you're, for instance, place yourself in the landlord's position and you, for instance, have a mortgage to pay. The bank is deferring. They're not waiving your obligation to pay. They're deferring. So you still technically have an obligation and an urgency to get your payments so that you can pay your rent. Where do you say that balance can be struck?
Now, I may be dodging your specific question on this, but I think we have to sort of take a bit of a macro approach to something like a landlord and a tenant dispute, especially when it relates to Bermuda. Now, in Bermuda, I personally think that when it comes to land ownership, that's a very emotional topic for a lot of people, and perhaps more emotional than in other places. I mean, when you think about the fact that we live on a very small island, where not only homes are scarce, but you also have a lot of unoccupied homes right now from landlords who use their wages and who use the rent payments in order to pay their mortgages. It's a very tough call to make. You know, in a lot of places, you have landlords that own multiple properties and they're already wealthy. In Bermuda, that's not necessarily the case. You do have some landlords like that, but you also have landlords who are just renting out that studio part of their house in order to help make ends meet. And so I think the important thing to recognize in a situation like this is that you can't necessarily have a blanket policy or a blanket statement. You genuinely just might have to look at things on a case by case basis. And that's where the community comes in, because we all have to look and see and recognize our own responsibility, in my opinion, and say, how can I help ease this situation a little bit, with the understanding that if I cut somebody a break and I may take a small sacrifice, that might have a rebound effect on the entire community and the population as a whole. Do you understand what I'm saying with that?
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. What I would say is I think that channels into the discussion with respect to the banks and the mortgage deferrals and who should shoulder the responsibility and what particular leniency or what particular bargaining power does the government have with the banks to ask them or even demand. I think would be appropriate that they be lenient with members of the
Do you
community.
think that's possible? Does the government have the ability to tell the banks, or legislate or mandate that banks either hold their mortgage, payments, or do some more active, I guess, support than what they're doing now?
Well, I think there's twofold. From a legal point of view, you know that Parliament is preeminent, so whatever they want to do, unfortunately or fortunately, they can do. Whether or not the banks will have a response to that, obviously that's how the legal system goes. But there is always that mechanism, and that's why we have elected officials. That's why we have Parliament, because Parliament can enact legislation. We've seen stranger things occur in Parliament for legislation that they want to enact that has certain consequences that, for instance, a particular entity or institution is not happy with. So we know that they have that power. But when you look at it on the circumstance or a practical point of view, where this particular government has had to go to those banks and borrow money, so you're in a debt position from the government to these very institutions, what actual practical implications does that have? Are you really practically able to go to the same institution that you owe hundreds of millions of dollars to in debt and demand?
Well, let's take it apart a little bit further then. I want to get your personal opinion. I think we can recognize, and I think that's an important acknowledgement to make, is that the government does have the power to order banks or institutions or anybody really to do certain things. They can reappropriate land, they can hold taxes, they can make all sorts of different legislative provisions which have the impact of easing the burden for some and maybe harshening it for others. What do you think should be the position when it comes to the banks and the mortgage rates and the lending that's currently taking place? I'm particularly mindful of the fact, and here's my concern, Aaron, right? Some of the banks have said that they will hold mortgage payments for a temporary period because they know that a lot of people are out of work, right? Now, my concern is that when they eventually allow those payments to be made again, there will be a whole bill of interest that's on top of that, which means that not only are people suffering more when they do start paying, but the banks are also making more money off of this crisis, in the sense that not only have you delayed payments, but when you do get those payments back, because you will get them back somehow, you're going to tack an interest on top of it, or people are going to start getting their homes repossessed because they couldn't keep up with the delays in payments. So I want to know, what do you personally think? We can talk about duties of banks all day long, and ultimately the duty of any corporate institution is to its shareholders. So we know that there's no legal obligation for them to ease the burden per se. But personally, from your perspective, what do you think should be mandated, or what do you think should be happening in this area?
Well, I think that you'll remember that not too far in the distant past, this government, our government, I say this government, the Bermuda government, had to bail out one of our local banks and institutions. And so you look at it from that perspective, that Today, I need you, and tomorrow you'll need me. And so I think that there are going to have to be some tough decisions that need to be made. I don't think that it can just be just the discussion and axing, as you say, corporate entities whose only duty is truly legislatively to their shareholders. You can't just have that expectation that they're going to forego it for longer than they've already announced it. And those announcements of deferring payments, as you say, don't come without conditions. For example, you had individuals who were already within financial and economic constraints before, so they may not qualify for the deferrals because of the economy, the state of the economy previously, and their rate of income. They had already been behind, because one of the conditions, for example, is that you had to be current in order to qualify for a deferral. So if you were already struggling in the old,
true.
Absolutely. There are certain conditions. There's not just a blanket restriction and it's bespoke to each of the different banks and institutions. But one of the conditions is that you got to be current. You had to have been current. Now, if you were struggling before, and we're now talking about, giving a deferral that you don't qualify for, well, I mean, that's low hanging fruit, right? Because you don't qualify for it, so you don't get the deferral. You've not been working. And that's not to say that these institutions are going to be wholly insensitive, but we're just looking at it straight up, opportunities or avenues available to them. Personally, I think that there will have to be some legislative amendments. I think that we'll have to take guidance from a legal point of view of what implications that may have. But then you also got the practical implications. You cannot implement something so stringent as to deter big corporate institutions from conducting business here in Bermuda, because when you do things such as you mentioned, the reappropriation of land or property and the like, it does look at potential investors do look at that as a risk, as a real risk. So the government have a balancing act. So yes, Ryan, whilst I personally would like to see some legislation passed, I do understand that the realistic prospect of that happening because of the practical implications is really non-existent.
Well, I think we can understand just about anything from a theoretical point of view, but I mean, for me, it ultimately comes down to priorities, right? Because from any point of view, it's not about right or wrong, really. It's just about the view from where you sit and what you need.
Let me ask you this then. Let me ask you this. I'll stop you there and I'll ask you this. What do you, in this point of view, you're an elected official charged with dealing with the banking aspect of this matter and how you address or alleviate the burden to your citizens. How do you deal with it? How do you have that conversation, or do you have conversations with the bank, or do you go and pass legislation, bearing in mind all the practical implications and considering that realistically you're already in debt to some of these institutions already?
Well, I mean, from a starting point, it's always important to consult with everybody, right? You want to get different perspectives. You want to get different views. Just from us having this little back and forth, we may change our views. So I would never really recommend just doing something without at least consulting, engaging opinions. Now, that's not to say you can't listen to an opinion from somebody and do something to the contrary anyway, but you do need to at least hear as many sides of the story as you can. Now, having said that, as far as what should be done, on our last series, we talked a little bit about how government has paid out over $8 million so far in unemployment benefits. And the concern expressed was that a lot of that money is going to the person at the bottom, and then it's just trickling right back up the chain. So you're paying somebody who's completely unemployed, struggling to make ends meet, so that they can then pay their landlord, the grocery stores, electricity company, all the bills, the mortgage. So that money is going to the person at the bottom in the hopes that all of their money is going to trickle right back up to the top. I'm wondering, do we have it backwards? Do we have it upside down? So if, for example, we're providing relief to certain people on, let's say, land tax, is that money being passed down to the actual tenant, or is the person that owns that land or has that mortgage now just pocketing that extra money for their own savings? So I think it's important that no matter what we decide, we have to see who needs the help the most and how is it actually impacting them. One of our recent persons who commented and gave us feedback on our series was asking, can we just see the financial situations of each of these businesses and then decide how much relief we want to give them? And I know that that's not completely possible, but from an idealist point of view, it does make you wonder, are we providing relief to businesses with millions and billions of dollars and then ignoring the little man on the street with no savings? So ultimately, I would say I would like to see some sort of relief from government, or something which mandates that where necessary, businesses are providing certain relief packages to the person on the street,
And that's why I think it's important during the course of this series, and so that our viewers know, we're going to have some experts from the private sector, particularly in like the banking and insurance and reinsurance industry, to provide us some specific guidance and expert opinion from on the ground, so to speak. What they're actually seeing, the contemplations that they're having, the decisions making that they're having, because we may have, again, these ideological views and, to say, well, look, principally this is the position that has to take, whereas they can say fundamentally that is not actually possible, or perhaps we can do it in a different way. So I think we're pontificating, we're saying, we don't have the expertise or the niche expertise in these actual fields that some of our guests in the future will have. And so I think it'll be important to, again, share these ideas with those guests and say, well, what is actually the feasibility? What does that actually look like? Again, I think that's going to shape part of what we do moving forward, because those are the considerations that have to be had. Now, I just want to pause momentarily, because we were just discussing, for instance, the relationship between media and government, and my presence at last evening's press conference, and some of the questions that were asked. And, there were undertakings to provide information before or at the next press conference. And I'm just advised now by Bernews that the government has followed up and actually provided an answer to a question that I asked last evening. I just want to say that is the type of relationship that you want to engender between the media and government in times like this, because ultimately the answer is for the benefit of the public. And the answer is this, that the government has said that the hospital has capacity for 29 people on ventilators. Currently, there are 3 people on ventilators and 4 people in ICU. And I think the only thing that's missing there is how many available beds we still have, but hopefully they're collating that information. But the mere fact that they've responded in less than 24 hours to a question and an undertaking that was given yesterday, much applause needs to be given to the government. And I think that speaks to the level of communication and relationship that is needed at this particular time.
So it looks like we resolved one of our topics already. I mean, as long as we can keep that up, and the viewers continue to feed us questions, and those questions continue to be asked, then I'm sure government will be committed to answer them.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point in time, we just want to do a brief wrap up and give our viewers a preliminary view as to what we intend to discuss over the coming weeks. Particularly, again, we want to get some experts from the private sector to answer some of the questions. So again, if we have anybody listening that can provide some expert advice, some niche advice on any of the private sector things like banking, like reinsurance and corporate institutions, what corporate responsibility policies that these institutions actually have, because we don't have that information to hand. So we can give, constructive criticism by saying, oh, well, look, we think that they should take this action, whereas they may have policies in action that I think this opportunity is for dialogue so that we can actually properly understand, because ultimately you have tenants who are sitting at home now and saying, hey, look, I don't think that it's fair. You've got landlords who are sitting there and saying, well, I've got to collect my rent. I hear you guys saying, I should be lenient on my tenants, but hey, the bank's not easing me up.
So we'll do, as far as we know.
No, absolutely. So we look forward to over the coming weeks being able to have those guests on the show and being able to take advantage of their expert advice. But is there anything particularly that you want to say in closing or wrapping up, Ryan, as we look forward to our next series?
I think this is an ongoing conversation, isn't it? So, we've talked a lot today, and a lot of what we've talked about is sort of an extension of what we addressed in our first series. So we ranged from shared sacrifice and leading by example, and pivoted that into sort of mortgages and banks and lending and tenants. And we hope to maybe in future series have some lawyers come on and some banking experts to actually talk and debate and have that conversation. So I think the most important thing to note about today so far, is that it's an ongoing conversation, and we're guided by the feedback of the people and the public, as well as the experts that we have on hand. And so, with all that Deon Smith talked about today, about the need to adapt, about the changing climate when it comes to things like tourism and business and education, we hope to sort of use that as a template and expand on each of those topics in subsequent shows.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. Well, we want to give thanks again to our guest for today, Mr. Deon Smith of Smith Technologies. And we want to again thank our initial guests, Mr. Stratton Hatfield and Sierra Burrows, for their contributions. And we also want to extend an opportunity to anybody who's out there listening who would like to use this platform to get information out there to the public during these times. Please reach out to us on the email address that you will see scrolling in the bottom of the screen very shortly, COVID-19 series at Bernews.com. And we look forward to continuing this discussion, this dialogue moving forward. And we thank you for the opportunity to provide. We want to again thank Bernews for the opportunity for allowing us to be present during the press conferences. And again, I can't stress this enough, because a lot can be lost during the dialogue, you and I having debates and throwing out ideas and such, that we're criticizing, for instance, the government or saying what they should do or what they're not doing. But we want to thank, I can't thank them enough in the strongest terms for respecting that undertaking and getting back information, particularly with respect to one of the questions in short order. The Premier and his team ought to be commended and applauded for that. And we hope that we can engender that relationship between the media and government moving forward, because it only serves to the benefit of the public. Having said that, that concludes our second of many series to come for the Bernews special COVID-19 series. Ryan, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully we can get out of these suits now and get back to
Likewise, my brother. So thank you very much to all our listeners, and until next time.